This is a really critical place because if you're off at all with your lines, you're going to notice it afterwards. So sometimes it's best if you redo the lines. And students will get pretty close and they'll think that's good enough, but the truth is if you spend a little bit more time and make sure your line is exactly right, it will save you a lot of time of trying to fix out a little bump later when you're sanding it. So what I do is I get the ruler lined up exactly with the bottom of both of those circles I just drilled, and then redo my pencil line across there so I have an exact line I can match up to with my jigsaw. And then the last thing I'm going to do before I use my jigsaw is I'm going to put a line right down the middle, and I'll show you what that's for. Remember, when you put your clamps on and put them upside down, if you put them this way, you'll have the rest of the clamp sticking up at you. So flip them over when you put them on and tighten those down. And you may need to pull the board off farther so that the rest of your jigsaw can slide past as you're cutting. Looks like I'm just past my clamp here, so I think it'll work. The reason I put this middle line here is I'm going to see if I can hold a true line with this before I start cutting on the important ones. So I'm going to cut down this middle line just to the side of it. If I cut right on the line, I won't be able to see my line afterwards. I won't know how close I was. I don't know if I was on or not. So I'm going to cut to one side of that line, and if I can hold that line when I cut through there, then I know I'm safe to cut these other two. So what I want to be able to do is see just the bare side of my pencil line, and if that's what I can see, then I know that I'm safe to go ahead and cut along these lines. If I can't see my line when I get done, odds are I bumped into it, and the same situation is going to happen over here. And so I want to maybe do another line and test another one, cut it again before I go to my final. Because if I ever go past my line, I have to do sanding to catch up with it, and it's really hard to, pretty soon you get a wart on the side of your project. So best to just cut it straight the first time. I have some students that cut a long way in, like 1/8 of an inch or so, and then they think they're just going to sand it. But that's really hard too, to sand in a straight line with a spindle sander. So it's best, again, to try and cut as close as you can on that cut. This template, again, is a little artsy-fartsy, and so I have some lines I've adjusted here. The original template you get should be correct, and you shouldn't need to change any lines unless you're doing something like a Star Wars gun. I'm going to cut around here with a bandsaw, and again, I'm going to stay as close as I can to the lines, but if I need to, I want to leave a 1/16 inch gap. It's always best to leave more, and then you can come back and sand. But if I cut right on the line, I need to make sure I'm right, because once I cut past the line, it's really hard to tell where I am and if it's going to be a straight line anymore. The most critical spot on here is going to be this bottom edge. This bottom edge is what's going to sit on your project as you push it through the table saw. So this line, I need to make really, really sure that my blade from the bandsaw is on the outside edge of that line. I want to see that line when I get done. If I can see that line, it means I can still get 100%. If I can't see that line, it means I'm going to have to sand up, because I need this to be dead set. If it's rounded at all when you're pushing something through the table saw, it's not going to be safe. So I have to spend my most time on that. The rest, is more for looks, and I can play with a sander if I need to. Again, the inside corners are going to be hard to cut out with this bandsaw. I've got a pretty small band. I think I got a 1/4 inch on this one, so I should be able to cut these okay. But again, it's dependent on what I want to sand. So I'm going to use the spindle sanders next to clean these up, and we'll get started now. Okay, now I'm going to use the spindle sander. And again, the sanders are specifically for fine tuning. If you've got more than a 1/16 of an inch, you probably want to go back to the bandsaw, get your lines a little closer. Because if you're sitting on the spindle sander, whatever type of sander you have, there's probably going to be a line of students behind you, which means you're doing it wrong. So for mine, you can probably tell there's very little sanding that needs to actually be done. Or just fine-tuning the little corners and stuff. A lot of mine I have sharp corners, and because of those sharp corners I'm going to have to take a file in there, straight edge file, to clean those up. The sander's not going to work. Again, if you're using the sander, what's going to happen if I use the spindle sander on this bottom part is I'm going to leave a whole bunch of divots. So I don't want to use the spindle. Anything that's round, I don't want to use on something that's supposed to be flat and straight afterwards. So this is specifically, these two sanders are for getting in the corners, cleaning that stuff out, and then I'll come back with sandpaper, the disc sander, or sandpaper to a file to clean up my straight edges. I forget some things because I've been using this sander for so long, but if you lift it up, you get, it's quite possible to get an angle on your project. Instead of it going straight through, it'll be tapered at an angle. I've been doing this long enough that I know that instinctively, but if you do lift it up, which you're not supposed to do, there's better sandpaper near the top of the spindle here, and so it's more aggressive and it's going to take more wood off faster. And I was doing that instinctively, but if a student does it and is not thinking about it, you're going to get an angle. So if you do lift it up, if your instructor allows you to do that, make sure you put it back down again at the end and sand it so that it's square again when you get done. I forgot about those things. What I'm trying to do here is make sure I get any bandsaw marks out where it's round. So I'm getting in there and making sure anywhere I came in from two different angles, I'm cleaning that up. So when you look at it afterwards, you won't be able to see any of those bandsaw marks. Now that I've got all the tight corners, I'm going to switch over to the bigger spindle here, and then I'll come back and finish my inside handle. So the last part to sand with a spindle is going to be this interior, and you might be able to tell from the camera, but there's a little bit of extra thickness right here in the middle where you can still potentially see a little bit of line there, and then it drops down on both sides where the circle radius was. So I need to take this middle part down a little bit. Now optimally I wouldn't want to use a round sander to make something straight, but I'm going to hold it very steady and guide it straight across there, and I'm not going to let it bounce around. If it bounces around, it'll follow its own pattern, but I'm going to hold it steady and try and sand straight across here as I cut, and same on the opposite side. Sometimes it's better to flip it upside down so that you don't have any extra pencil lines, and you can actually see your line, your cut line, instead of a pencil line to see if you're straight or not.